A landslide victory for the former party of Robert Mugabe. But will unrest following allegations of cheating mar the election results? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Zimbabwe's general election. Despite ZANU-PF's nearly 40-year rule under one strongman, Zimbabwe's rural voters turned out in droves to cast their ballots for Robert Mugabe's former political party. Or did they? The opposition movement for democratic change says there was vote rigging and irregularities by the Electoral Commission. Opposition leaders have also tweeted that they won outright and even threatened to release their own results. So do they have a case? Or is the opposition in denial that even with Mugabe gone, they still won't be running the show? Here's Shoaib Hassan.
Accusations of mismanagement and of rigging following a landmark election in Zimbabwe. It marks a formal transfer of power while turning the page on the reign of former President Robert Mugabe. His nearly 40-year rule ended after he was overthrown in a coup and replaced with current incumbent Emmerson Mnangagwa last year. The former Mugabe loyalist is now head of the ruling ZANU-PF party, one of the frontrunners. ZANU-PF's toughest competitor is Nelson Chamisa and his Movement for Democratic Change, or MDC party. Popular with young people, they have questioned the integrity of the vote.
We are, however, seriously concerned about evidence of interference with the people's will that is being displayed by the authorities. So, for instance, as I'm talking to you right now, there is a deliberate delay in formally announcing results.
Zimbabwe's election authority has denied any irregularities.
That there was no rigging, and we would like to assure the Zimbabwean people that we as the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission will not steal their choice of leaders. We will not subvert their will. Whatever it is that comes out in our results is exactly what they decided in Peru.
But international observers disagree.
In some cases it works very smoothly, but in others we see that it's totally disorganized and that people become angry, that people leave. And we have not found out whether that is coincidence or bad organization.
The voting took place after a charged but largely peaceful campaign, with the ZANU-PF and Mnangagwa initially well ahead in the polls. But the latest polls suggest the gaps being nearly closed by the MDC, whose call for change has resounded with Zimbabwe's predominantly young voters.
We're tired of partisan politics that, doesn't serve the people. We're tired of a partisan political system that doesn't offer any solutions to the cash crisis, to legislative issues, to social issues. We're tired of that.
It's an agenda that received backing from an unlikely source, former President Mugabe, who said he had voted for what he called a new Zimbabwe. But current President Mnangagwa says while he agrees there's need for a new direction, it's the ZANU-PF that's best suited to deliver change.
This coming Monday, we will win the elections. We are voting for the future. We are not voting for today or for tomorrow. We are voting for generations to come. Together we will unlock the potential of our beloved homeland. Together we will build a new Zimbabwe for all.
Will either candidate get a clear mandate? Or will Zimbabwe's latest election remain as mired in controversy as its recent political past? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
Well, to discuss Zimbabwe's election, representing the ruling party, former Deputy Information Minister Bright Matonga. With the opposition, the spokesman for the MDC alliance in the UK, Makusha Mugabe, and in Bulawayo, research analyst Mandipa Ndlovu. Thanks all so much for joining us. We greatly appreciate it. And I'm going to start then with Makusha, because opposition protesters are out on the streets right now, protesting, some violently, in metropolitan areas in Zimbabwe, saying the vote was not fair. What is your message to them?
Well, The message to them is actually that they are in the right. It's seeming as if the only way to get their message through is through protest, and we have been protesting civilly. We have been protesting through the courts. We have been protesting through writing to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. We have been very civil, and it seems the only message that ZANU-PF seems to understand is this kind of...
Makusha, the Election Commission has heard your complaints and has said that their count and their validation of that count is legitimate. ZANU-PF has won. Do you feel the Election Commission cannot at all be trusted?
In fact, it cannot, because in the first place, their voters' roll, which is supposed to be really the document that provides, that proves who is a legitimate voter and who is not a clear document. We don't have a copy, and I don't think anybody else has got a copy. The High Court had to step in on Sunday to force them to release this document, and we're not even sure that anybody else has got it up to now. So the way for us to check whether the voting was correct or not was through that document, and we don't have it. Okay. Then the second way of checking was the V11 forms, which are provided at the polling stations. At the beginning of the voting, we stayed up through the night. At the beginning of the voting, it was going very well. They were posting the V11 forms signed by our agents and signed by the other agents. Then as the night went on and they realized that the MDC was winning this, or that the Nelson Chamisa was winning, they started all kinds of ways of stopping the publishing of this V11
Makusha,
forms.
I need to get to our other guests in. I can see Bright Matonga vehemently disagrees. Go ahead, Bright.
Hello, I think it's very unfortunate what is happening and what I'm hearing from my colleague. Everyone had access to campaigning. It was free and fair. There were no disturbances. Demonstrations are allowed in Zimbabwe. MDC Alliance, they spent most of their time in Harare rather than going outside the countryside to campaign. They didn't do that. They focused in the urban areas where there are 62 seats, and that's what they got. ZANU-PF spend most of their time. We spend our time campaigning, reaching out to our supporters, and we won. The voters' roll was available to everybody, even the embassies. I know quite a number of embassies, including the European, the British. They had their, the voters' roll. I'm surprised that the MDC are saying that they didn't have access to the voters' roll. It's very unfortunate. Yes.
Let me just ask Mandeepa, as an observer here, where is this disconnect, and are the protesters right to be out on the streets now? Was something wrong with this election?
The disconnect for me lies in the MDC taking to the streets, especially when Zimbabwe is, first of all, a traumatized nation. Zimbabwe is a very volatile nation, and its people are very, very volatile right now. The need for change is one that you can see on people's faces. It's, you can see it as these people are protesting. It's that deep yearning. And there is need to practice restraint and follow legal mechanisms, for instance, the electoral court or court, and allow those processes to come through. There is a statement produced by MDC leadership asking their protesters, asking their supporters, to come out and practice restraint and not to jump force violence on matters, because we all know that taking to the streets.
Right. Let me ask you though, Mandeepa, because as far as the results are concerned thus far, it's a dynamic we've seen in various countries. But in Zimbabwe, why is it that the rural voters are overwhelmingly in favor of continued rule of ZANU-PF? And in metropolitan areas, you see this want for dramatic change in the form of voting in an entirely new party.
I think across voting spaces, whether it's urban or rural, there is an inherent need for bread and butter issues. So whether we're talking rural, whether we're talking urban, it is essentially bread and butter issues. What those bread and butter issues look like are varying. You see, in the urban areas, you may be calling for fast speed trains, where in rural areas, it really is just food, it is access to, fresh running water, as is in the urban areas and spaces like that. So you need to understand how what your voters need and what they want at the same time. And there have been the past trends that have been experienced in Zimbabwe. Voting trends have not changed. Okay. So ZANU-PF has continued. So ZANU-PF has continued to. Yes.
I just need to ask Makusha then. What are you lacking here? Why can't the opposition actually appeal to these rural voters that seem to continue winning elections for ZANU-PF?
Yes, I would actually like to disagree a little bit here with Mandipa, because the MDC has actually captured the rural vote. If you have seen the campaigning that the MDC rallies have been well attended in rural areas by people who were marching themselves to the rallies, who were not being provided with transport, they were not being helped in any way, but they were attending the rallies and supporting the MDC. It's actually not true that there is a rural voter which is strictly ZANU-PF. We were getting, even up to last night, the rural votes were in favor of MDC. We won quite a few seats. But as soon as they realized that even the rural vote was the MDC, they stopped releasing the results, and something went on. We have got a few footages which are showing actual fights where soldiers were coming in with ballot boxes which were pre-voted. It was these ballots which were delivered to rural areas, and it was done to rural areas. It was done to rural areas because there are no observers and monitors in large enough numbers. That was the reason.
Mandipa, I'll let you get a quick response in before I get to Bright. Go ahead. I can see you had something to say.
I think it is incorrect and a bit inaccurate to say that there were no observers in rural areas, first and foremost. There were observers in the rural areas. But I think it's also important to remember that people mostly vote on partisan lines because they are afraid of the black and because they're afraid of gray areas. People do not like gray areas, and it is undeniable that the MDC has managed in this election to pull massive numbers that a lot of people did not expect, and credit where credit is due, they have been able to do that. But you also have to understand that the tact that has been used in both forerunning parties has been very, very different. The tact by ZANU-PF, for instance, with its command agriculture, going out into the rural areas and giving immediate bread and butter issues is something that someone will take into consideration. It's stomach politics, and we must not take that for granted.
Okay.
The numbers may be there, and I cannot speak to the ballot boxes that have been spoken about, the ones that were carrying marked ballot papers, because I have not received those as confirmed, because they haven't been investigated yet. They still stand as alleged. But we
okay.
Again,
the clock is ticking, so let me get to Bright Matonga first. I mean, I need to ask you the reverse of the question that I posed to Makusha. Why has ZANU-PF failed to appeal to most urban voters?
The voting in Zimbabwe is split between rural and urban voters. Since the inception of the MDC about 20 years ago, most ZANU-PF lost votes supporting most, if not all, the urban areas. We regained in a few in 2013. So that has been the trend. There are 62 seats in urban centers and 148 in rural areas. So, politics is a game of numbers. If you don't do your calculations right, you lose out.
Okay.
MDC, they focused on Twitter, on social media. That's where the campaign was. We were on the ground, quietly mobilizing our people, making sure that we get the numbers that we wanted. And I'm happy that those numbers came out, and they came out big.
Okay.
And I think the problem with the MDC is that they're bad losers. You can't be complaining and inciting people to go in the street all the time when you lose. It can't be a win because you've won. They've won in urban areas by big numbers, 30,000 in Harare and 20,000 in certain areas. They're not complaining. And unfortunately, because they had sold this dummy to the world that they're going to clear things up, because they didn't do their numbers properly, and they've lost. I think it's important that we follow the law, we respect the law. We don't just respect the law because it is in your favor. This is unfortunate, and let's wait for Zimbabwe Electoral Commission to announce all the results. Then we can have a proper discussion. And MDC, they need to go back on the drawing board and see where they went wrong.
But let's...
And I'll tell you where...
I'd like to look at some of the official results so far, which say that ZANU-PF has attained that crucial two-thirds majority in parliament to be able to change the constitution, if wanted. Let me ask Makusha, where does that leave the opposition?
No, in fact, we have said we are not recognizing these results. There's obviously going to be protest. We are taking it to the courts because we have no choice. The courts are captured, but despite them being captured, that's the only channel that there is. So we're going to dispute this, and the evidence is plenty to show that this has not been a fair and free election. So that's one avenue we are going to go down. But I think we are also, what I'm saying is that people have reached a point of no return because so many years we are still facing the same issues where the ZANU-PF manipulates elections, forces itself into government. After getting into government, it fails to deliver.
Okay.
So people are suffering from poverty. People are suffering from disease. People are just suffering from a country that is just at a standstill. It's not.
Then let me ask Mandeepa, as the observer here, what do you think the end game will be for this vote? You're hearing the opposition say that no, we will not accept these results. But both you and Bright Matonga seem to think that what the Electoral Commission says should be respected. There's also the issue, as I brought up with Makusha there, that the ZANU-PF does have that crucial two-thirds majority. I'd like for you to address as well what that means for Zimbabwe going forward as far as real change is concerned.
Okay. So I think it's important that the MDC not subvert the constitutional rights of all the people that did, in fact, vote for ZANU-PF. It may be a bitter pill for them to swallow, but numbers and alleged doctoring aside, we have to agree that some people did, in fact, vote for ZANU-PF. And it's important for them to allow those people to exercise their constitutional rights, and fairly so. This is what democracy is all about. In respect to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, it's not just Mr. Matonga and myself, it is everyone that has observed the elections, from the EU Commission to the AU to SADC and other external observers, because we understand the need to uphold institutional systems and to keep that in place in order to keep the state at a stable place that will allow a transition, even if the election is contested, to be peace and stable. Now that the ZANU-PF has gained a 2/3 majority, it's important to note that even if Nelson Chamisa comes out as the winner of the presidential election, we do not know the outcome yet. It hasn't been announced by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. He will be a weak president if these results do get carried forward uncontested and unchallenged, as the MDC say. Well, if the MDC is not successful in contesting the election, in contesting the result, because with a two-party, as you said, they'll be able to change the constitution, and he will be a weak president, which will be problematic in implementing the change that he wants to see.
Okay, Mandipa.
Yeah.
I will have to give you the last word because, unfortunately, we are completely out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers, but I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, will self-rule for Muslims in the Philippines stop a conflict that's killed more than 100,000 people? And should Donald Trump be impeached? Famed American lawyer Alan Dershowitz comes to his defense. He's with us next. It's an independence movement that's killed more than 100,000 people in the Philippines. And President Rodrigo Duterte hopes he can end it by giving Muslims in Mindanao a new autonomous region called Bangsamoro. Self-rule means they'll get their own parliament and budget. And in return, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, a rebel group known for kidnappings, attacks, and criminality, has agreed to disband. But will this end the decades of conflict? With more, here's Natalie Pohonen.
After decades of unrest in Mindanao, the road to peace for the region's Muslim majority is opening up. The Moro Islamic Liberation Front is the largest Muslim rebel group in the Philippines. It has both fought and negotiated with governments since the 1970s to achieve greater autonomy for parts of Mindanao in this predominantly Catholic nation. The rebels are now on the cusp of achieving it, because in July, President Rodrigo Duterte signed the Bangsamoro Organic Law to grant that autonomy.
I make this solemn commitment that this administration will never deny our Muslim brothers and sisters the basic legal tools to chart their own destiny within the constitutional framework of our country.
Al-Hajj Murad Ibrahim is the leader of the rebels. This new law could be the ultimate victory for him.
We really hope this is a key to moving forward, and we hope na wala nang sagabal dito after this.
For years, the central government in Manila has tried to end the conflict in the southern Philippines. It created the autonomous region in Muslim Mindanao, but for the rebels, it wasn't true autonomy, and they continued fighting. Under the new law, that territory will become the expanded Bangsamoro region. It will have a parliament, a chief minister, and its own judicial system. It will also get to keep 75% of the taxes collected in the region. The remainder will go to Manila. Bangsamoro doesn't exist yet. The area's people will be asked to vote on the law in a referendum later this year.
This is the beginning of peace in Mindanao. This is the start of unity between Muslims and Christians.
This is our dream. If we end this fighting, hopefully we can live in peace. Most people want peace, and so do we in the rebel forces. What the Moro Islamic Liberation Front has achieved is not just for our group, but for all of Mindanao.
There is a sense of optimism, but it's being kept in check by the history of the region. Just last year, the Philippine government was fighting to retake the city of Marawi from Daesh and its affiliated groups. At about the same time, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front was battling a splinter group that had pledged loyalty to Daesh. But now these fighters could be about to put away their weapons for good and try to build a peaceful civilian life. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Davao is Datu Mussolini Lidasan. He is a commissioner for the Bangsamoro Transition Commission. And in Manila, defense consultant Jose Custodio. Thanks both so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Jose, let me begin with you. Duterte would like to hail this as a victory, and it may prove to be, but first it has to go to a referendum. Where do you think that referendum will actually go? What do the people genuinely want?
Well, basically, people genuinely want peace, okay? So, on the ground, people would most likely be favorable with what's going on here, okay? But that's, like I said, that the thing is that it's still in the beginning stages. There's a lot of work to be done, okay? So, even if the law is passed, and if the law is, the referendum is passed and the people support it, the thing is, what is important is the actual programs and policies that will create the necessary conditions for peace. Will it then be accepted by the various sectors that make up the communities in Mindanao? If these sectors, like for example, the secessionist movement, you know, the military, the communities, the mixed communities, actually, the ethnically mixed communities, if the various sectors there will really, from vocal support, would actually now commit to peaceful, to realize the peaceful agenda of this law.
Okay. Let me ask Datu. Datu, do you think the Bangsamoro organic law, as it stands, is the best way, primarily to fight extremism, that it was the religious extremism that Duterte set out to annihilate?
Well, we need to understand the context here that the Bangsamoro peace process has been happening for more than 40 years, and formal peace talks with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front started more or less 20 years ago. So the MILF is for now, is the largest Bangsamoro armed group. And since they started having the formal peace talks, we've seen that there are relatively peaceful communities already in Mindanao. However, because of the government keeps on prolonging the peace process from 1976 with the MNLF, 1996 GRP-MNLF peace agreement, with the CAB, Comprehensive Agreement of the Bangsamoro, and the FAB. So there has been series of evolution of armed groups. And these armed groups are classified by the current administration as violent extremists. We have the BIFF, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters. They evolved when the government failed to pass MOA-AD, the Memorandum of Agreement of the Bangsamoro, during the time of President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. When the government failed to pass the Bangsamoro Basic Law during the time of President Aquino, Noynoy Aquino, a new group emerged. This is the Maute, which took over last year the city of Marawi. So yeah, so the government now is very clear in its mandate to really put a closure to the Bangsamoro peace process by granting the Moro people an organic law that will serve as a way for them to express their right to self-determination.
We understand there is a lot of history here. There are a lot of arguments for the case that the government failed miserably at trying to attain the peace that was needed in the region. But as it stands now, some analysts are still saying that there will be so many legal, constitutional challenges to what this is. And an even bigger problem is that the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the MILF, isn't really prepared to serve in the political capacity that it would need to serve, the administrative capacity that it would need to serve, to work, to carry out this peace agreement and to administer this region.
Well, first, we in the Bangsamoro Transition Commission, we tried our best to pass an organic law that will be free from legal infirmities. We have members of the Senate and members of the House of Representatives, Senator Franklin Drilon, former Majority Floor Leader Pareñas. They made sure, and we made sure, and in the BTC, that we pass an organic law that is free from legal infirmities. And we are confident that even if there are some questions in the Supreme Court, this can stand any legal questions. On the question of the MILF absorptive capacity in terms of administration, well, last Sunday, as you can see, I was there. I attended that Bangsamoro assembly. I was together with Chairman Hagi Murad. We were there in that stage. And he was very open. He said that they admit that the Moro Islamic Liberation Front has been in the revolutionary government for several years. And now it's a big challenge for them to shift their mind or to have a paradigm shift in running a government. So that's why it's an inclusive. I myself, I am not an MIL, but I am part of the government panel,
Okay. Jose, I could see you weren't quite convinced by some of what Datu had to say.
From the government side, okay, especially from the military side, there is skepticism also about the intentions of the MILF, okay, and its capacity to control the rank and file, okay. At the same time, there's also a lot of distrust, okay, that I said, between the military and the secessionist groups, okay. So I think that can actually be a problem in the as this peace process goes on. Okay, one thing that we have to take into consideration here is that hopefully it doesn't become a pattern now. Okay, but there has been a pattern before, wherein once a rebel organization goes into a peace process with the government, that a breakaway group emerges. Okay, because it doesn't want to accept what the government is, and because, like I said, there are objectives that those who break away feel will not be addressed if they come into compromise with the government. For example, the creation of a genuine Bangsamoro state, okay, and that is not under control of a central government based in Manila. So those things have happened. Okay, I think the first Datu had already mentioned that groups had broken away. Okay, so you had, for example, in the 1970s, you had the Moro National Liberation Front. Then, when it went into a peace agreement with the government, a breakaway group came out, which was the MILF. Okay, and usually it's because of the fact that the central leadership of these rebel organizations have difficulty sometimes in controlling the rank and file. Okay, so that will be one big challenge. Okay, the thing also there is that yes.
No, I was just going to say. Yeah, I mean, there are several major challenges here, and one of them, on the topic that you're speaking, is about the very weak state institutions that exist right now that have to be built.
Yeah.
And the question about the lack of experience of the new regime that will be in charge in building just those basic institutions, while, of course, dealing with some very serious ethnic tribal rivalries that exist in the region. It is a lot to take on.
Well, the thing is that much of although common narrative would be that this is caused by the rebellion is caused by colonial government rule over the Muslim communities. Okay, which causes the rebellion. There are also other factors that create support to rebels in this type of in Mindanao, and one of the topmost reasons would be the feudal political relations that would exist within many Muslim communities, wherein you have families, you have power concentrated on a few, and even if you have a peace treaty, if you have that type of relations, okay, political relations, business relations, elite relations, then you are not really going to address the root problem. So those root problems have to be addressed by a peace treaty. Okay, there should be a corresponding social, economic reform that should happen and I think they all recognize that. Everybody recognizes that. Okay, the only problem is that how are we going to go about it? Okay, there would be a need for political will at the same time, but at the same time there should be a will for a very good strategy to approach that. Okay, the problem, however, with the current administration is that it has shown to have had problems in executing programs that it had started. An example of that is what has been happening in Marawi. Okay,
right.
There, despite a year that has passed, there has not been substantial relief operations. Okay,
absolutely.
So can you imagine now the entire
and dealing with that crushing
crushing
poverty as well that remains is another major challenge. Even established democracies and governments have struggled to deal with that around the globe. But another issue here that I need to get to with Datu is the agreement as part of this BOL, as it's called, the Bangsamoro Organic Law, is that 30% of the 40,000 or so weapons held by rebel fighters will have to be decommissioned. I need to ask you, Datu, is that realistic? Are you confident that that will happen smoothly as part of this transition?
It's going to face a lot of challenges because it's not only the MILF that are armed groups in Mindanao. Based on our estimates, there are more than 100,000 different armed groups. You also have the private armies, the other lawless elements. So we have to take in consideration that when the normalization, we call it in the peace process as the normalization phase, it must include all other groups because the MILF would definitely not agree if they'll be the only one that will going to be disarmed. So we need the organic law, the Bangsamoro Organic Law, for the phases of the comprehensive agreement of the Bangsamoro to be implemented. And we're hoping that once it is ratified, maybe this coming November or December, and the majority of the people from the ARMM and the 6 municipalities in Lanao del Norte and the 39 barangays, city of Cotabato and Isabela will vote yes, and then smoothly, quote and unquote, we'll have a process of normalization for the Bangsamoro.
Okay, Jose, let me just ask you, do you think the Bangsamoro Organic Law is really the best and only option to move this process forward and achieve peace?
Well, yeah, I believe so, that it's the only way, because several administrations prior to the Duterte administration have been pushing for a law that would address, that would at least jumpstart the peace process. So I think that's why it's very important. Okay, like I said, the previous administration, the Aquino administration, also had the BBL, okay, the Bangsamoro Basic Law. So this is a very necessary piece of legislation, law that needs to be implemented so that at least the conflict will not escalate. I'm not saying, see, let's be realistic here. There will still be conflict, okay? Because not at least coming from the MILF, hopefully, but again from groups within, okay? Especially fringe groups that have much more extremist agendas. Okay, like for example, yesterday, was it yesterday or a day ago, that a bomb went off in a checkpoint in Basilan. So that bomb attack, which caused the deaths of at least 10 people, expect the military to conduct operations. So there will still be conflict, okay? But with that type of law, there is at least a framework that all parties can look to in order to try to limit the conflict that has been going on. So it's the way I see it is that it's something that is useful as a jump starter for something that will eventually be more comprehensive in the future. It's not going to happen within the next few years. I mean, for example, if you just look at what happened in the earlier peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front, okay, a lot of things that the Ramos administration had hoped for would happen didn't occur. Okay. And next thing you know, the MNLF itself proved ineffective in even addressing the problem of the existence of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. Okay. So there are and I'm not even talking about the issues of mishandling of funds that came later on. Okay. And so those are the things. Those are the things that will be obstacles on the road. Okay. It looks like it looks so clear cut, but it's actually not.
Absolutely. I think you can both agree somewhat on that. But Jose, I will have to give you the last word because very unfortunately we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. Datu, I'd like to thank you both so much for joining us.
Millions of Americans know this president is unfit for office. They need to know that a Democratic Congress would do what is morally and urgently necessary for the health of our democracy.
The prospect of Democrats taking control of the U.S. Congress in November is inspiring more calls for Donald Trump to be impeached. But famed lawyer Alan Dershowitz says that would be a mistake. In his new book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump, Dershowitz argues that ousting the president would not equate to holding power to account, but instead would be criminalizing unpopular political views. He also writes that a special prosecutor's investigation into suspected collusion with Russia risks violating the U.S. Constitution. Well, let's welcome back to the program Alan Dershowitz, who joins us now from his home in New York and from San Diego, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Litman. Thanks both so much for joining us. Alan Dershowitz, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks,
You've never been a Trump supporter. You very vocally voted for Hillary Clinton. You supported her campaign. So before we get into the arguments for and against impeachment, I first need to ask you why you wrote this book.
I wrote this book because I was expecting that Hillary Clinton would be elected president, and I thought that the Republicans on day one would try to impeach her. They were already organizing to impeach her on January 21st of 2017. And I had already done the research on impeachment because I had helped represent Bill Clinton when he was impeached. And then when Donald Trump got elected president and they tried to impeach him, I thought it would be extremely hypocritical for me not to put forth my arguments that I would have put forth for Hillary Clinton for Donald Trump. I'm a neutral, objective, civil libertarian, and I always express my views without regard to partisanship. For me, the test is always the shoe on the other foot test. If the shoe were on the other foot, if it were Hillary Clinton who were being impeached, would I be making these arguments? The answer is yes. So it's Donald Trump, whose policies I disagree with and who I voted against, who is now being the subject of talk about impeachment. And so I decided to write the same book I would have written. In fact, to make the point, my publisher came out with a mock cover for the book called The Case Against Impeaching Clinton. The book is exactly the same, just the cover and the title are different.
Okay, so, I mean, the book is lengthy. We don't have time to go over every detail of it in this segment, but tell us, give us the gist of why you discourage impeachment in Trump's case.
Well, there are a lot of reasons. I don't make the political case against impeachment. Others are making it that it would backfire, that they would never get a vote in the Senate to vote him out, and therefore it would eventually hurt the Democrats. I don't make that argument. I make a purely constitutional argument. I went back to the original framers of the Constitution and came to the conclusion they wanted to make impeachment very hard. They rejected the argument that some put forward that a president can be impeached for maladministration of office or for doing a terrible job. And instead they opted for a process where the president had to be prosecuted in the Senate for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And I interpret that, and the framers interpret it, as meaning real crimes, actual crimes. Treason, bribery are real crimes. And I have seen no evidence of real crimes committed by Donald Trump. Maybe the evidence will emerge, and if so, I would change my view. But in the absence of evidence of real crimes, I think the case against impeachment is very strong.
Okay, so let me ask Harry, what do you make of the merits of this book and Alan's case against impeachment here?
Thanks, because that's what matters. Of course, we can all agree with the shoe on the other foot test, and we should be applying the same arguments no matter who's the president. But what matters is Professor Dershowitz's substantive constitutional views. He's got a two-part argument. The first is, as he's just said, you can only impeach for an actual crime on the books. As to that, I'll just say it's been widely rejected, and I'm quoting now Professor Dershowitz in saying that. The longest footnote in his book is all the scholars who disagree with him, and I'll just add to that Alexander Hamilton, who made clear in the Federalist the framers were much more worried about having another King George, a violation of public trust, than they were about, say, private finances. But I want to put that to the side, because the second big tenet of Professor Dershowitz is, I think, what really matters here. He says, and I'll quote him, that for the president, you may not question why he is doing things. If he, to put it, his words are, if he pardons, that's it. If he fires, that's it. And that's a really radical and I think inaccurate view. I'll just make 3 quick points about it. The first is it's wrong in the constitutional text. Treason and bribery, as he mentioned, already require the Congress to delve into the president's state of mind. Treason's a specific intent crime. Bribery has a corrupt purpose requirement. Second, as an outlier argument, in his own words, it's very odd that he gives no Supreme Court or case precedent at all, as far as I can see, and there are half a dozen Supreme Court cases going the other way. And then third, it seems to me clear the consequences of his views are extreme and something we would reject. It would mean that if he pardons, with the president, every illegal immigrant except Muslims, that would be okay. You can't look into the reasons. If he fires every Jewish member of the senior executive staff, that would be okay. If he fires, that's it. I think that's the implication of his view, and it must be wrong.
Alan, go ahead. I can see you had a response.
No, it's just not the implication of my views. He has my views all wrong. What I say is that if a president acts legitimately, if he pardons legitimately, obviously if he's given a bribe, that's a crime. But if he pardons somebody legitimately, the way George H.W. Bush pardoned Caspar Weinberger and 5 other people in order to make sure that they didn't point the finger back at him, and the special prosecutor in that case specifically found that he had done it to prevent the investigation from going forward, that you can't question a president's motives if his act was legitimate. If he refused to pardon Muslims, that act would be illegitimate. And that's what the Supreme Court held in the travel ban case. You look at the actions, not the motives. So my point is a rather different one, and that is if the president acts properly, firing Comey is a legitimate action, you can't question the president's motives. Why? Presidents have mixed motives, always. Part of their motives are financial. They want to write a good book and a profitable book after they leave office. Will this act help them get a big advance? They want to go down in history in a positive way.
Okay.
Will this act help them in a positive way? Will it help their party get reelected?
So a couple points, Andrea.
Will it do other things? When we start probing the motives of a president, let me finish. When we start probing the motives of a president, we really get to the British system. Now, for treason, of course, if you commit an act of treason, then intent is necessary. But I know of no crime in which a legitimate act can then be turned into a crime by looking and probing the motive of the president under Article 2 of the Constitution.
Harry, a quick response. The minutes are winding down, so we have other things to get to. Go ahead.
Two quick responses. First, this legitimate and properly is a new insertion from Professor Dershowitz. There's a lot in that, and obviously it must implicate some kind of thing about state of mind. On mixed motives, excuse me, Professor, on mixed motives, that's a pedestrian view in the criminal law you teach your class. Of course, it can be hard to ferret out the proper motives, but if you ferret it out, if you have a videotape of Trump saying, here's the reason I want to do it, and it's the same reason Nixon did say when the Congress impeached him for exactly this, then obviously you have a problem. It turns on motive necessarily.
There's no Supreme Court case that says you can impeach a president for non-criminal actions.
I'm a bit worried that the discussion might be getting out of the realm of the understanding of many of our international viewers here. It's highly specific. But let me ask you this.
Sorry.
Professor Dershowitz, do you perhaps recognize, as some have argued, that it is just at its most basic level somewhat dangerous in the political atmosphere in the United States right now to publish a book titled what you've titled it, knowing that many will rightly or wrongly see it as a political endorsement of a man whom you disagree with on most all accounts and whom many of your former supporters or his supporters, former supporters, would find dangerous for the United States?
I've been doing this all my life. When I was a student in college, I was very anti-communist, but I defended the rights of communists to teach and to speak, and people called me a communist sympathizer. When Nazis tried to march through Skokie, Illinois, in a neighborhood of Holocaust survivors, I objected to them trying to censor him and therefore defended the rights of Nazis to march through Skokie. People called me a Nazi sympathizer. When I defended O.J. Simpson, people said I was sympathetic to murder. All my life, I've defended people I've disagreed with. That's what a civil libertarian does. That's what a neutral, objective defender of the Constitution does. So, of course, many people have quite willfully, and some inadvertently, identified my defense of Trump's civil liberties and constitutional rights with support for his policy. So I go out of my way on every show to say, I disagree with his immigration policy.
Okay.
I wrote an op-ed against what he said at Charlottesville. I disagree with his tax policies, with his health care policies.
Okay.
I voted against him, but I demand that we have a single standard of civil liberties and constitutional law for everyone.
Okay, and quickly, Harry, is that ultimately good for democracy, even if you disagree?
Yeah, I agree it's commendable he wrote the book. What's deeply wrong-headed is the constitutional views that he advances in the book.
Okay.
So argue with them, that's fine, and we'll have a debate and let the public decide who's right. Ultimately, maybe the courts will decide who's right.
Okay. Professor Dershowitz, I will give you the last word there because very unfortunately we are out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you both, Harry Litman and Alan Dershowitz, so much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, the United States releases millions of dollars in aid to Egypt. Is the Trump administration supporting a government accused of human rights abuses? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.